evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good, not you've come to hear me. Well, thank you all for coming. We've got a great lineup of two speakers here. If I have to spend too much time introducing it to you, it probably means you've come to the wrong event. But we've got Professor Vernon Baltimore here, who is a professor at the Institute of Contemporary British History, previously at Brasenose College, Oxford. I don't really need to see that much. He's one of the leading experts, not the leading expert, on the UK Constitution and on the subject he's going to be talking about today, the referendum in historical perspective. And then after that, we've got Lord Butler, who was, among other things, a private secretary at Number 10 during the 1975 referendum under Harold Wilson, and subsequently was cabinet secretary and head of the Home Civil Service under 3 consecutive prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, and then Tony Blair, all of whom had their own particular approaches to Europe, which is an interesting subject in itself. So I'm now going to hand over to Vernon. Lord Butler's then going to respond, and then we will go to questions. So thank you very much, Vernon.
Well, thank you very much. It's easy to be a constitutional expert, I suppose, in a country which doesn't have a constitution. It's difficult. But as people will know, Europe has been the cause of numerous problems to British governments since the war. And perhaps the wisest thing about Europe was said shortly after the war in 1950 by Labour's Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, when he argued against Britain joining the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the precursor of the European Union. He said, once you open that Pandora's box, all sorts of Trojan horses will fly out. And Churchill criticised what Bevin did, but followed the same policy in office. And I once heard at Oxford, where I used to be, I once heard the historian A.J.P. Taylor say that Churchill twice saved this country, once by action in 1940, and once by inaction in 1951 when he refused to join the Coal and Steel Community. Now, we joined the European communities, as the European Union then was, in 1973 after 2 failed applications, but we wanted to be in, though not of, Europe, to quote Churchill again. And all prime ministers since then have tried to straddle 2 horses to get the benefits of membership, but to take account of the Eurosceptic feelings of the British public in the centre conjuring trick. But to change the metaphor, Europe has been a poisoned chalice for British prime ministers. I think it contributed to the downfall of Harold Macmillan, Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and helped split the Labour Party in the 1980s. There's only one prime minister who unequivocally triumphed over Europe, and that is Harold Wilson. Wilson's 74-76 government had one great success, perhaps short-term, success all the same, the European Referendum. And that was successful in the sense that our position in the European communities was legitimised and the Labour Party held together for the time being. That was our first national referendum. We've had one other national referendum on the alternative vote in 2011, and the 3rd one is being held on June 23rd. Now, in that first national referendum, voters were presented with a statement and then a question. And the statement was, the government have announced the results of the renegotiation of the UK's terms of membership of the European communities. The question which followed was, do you think the United Kingdom should stay in the European community, bracket the common market, end of bracket, question. And the referendum had been advocated, as today, primarily by those opposed to Europe, who wanted Britain to leave the European communities, but the result was a landslide victory for staying in Europe by 2-1. On a 2/3 turnout, roughly 2/3 voted yes and 1/3 no, and the result was announced on the 6th of June 1975, 31st anniversary of D-Day. And from this referendum experience, if you were incautious, which I'm sure no one in this audience would be, you would draw 2 conclusions. The first was that the Labour government of the day held a referendum because it sincerely wanted to discover what the British people thought about Europe. And the second was that the outcome showed that the British people were enthusiastic Europeans. And neither of those conclusions is true, and I'm going to show why. A remarkable feature at the time was that attitudes towards the European Union were almost the opposite of what they are today. The Conservatives were almost wholly united in favour of Europe. Margaret Thatcher, the new Conservative leader, almost as enthusiastic then as he. And it had some surprising supporters. And Nicholas Ridley, who later became a Eurosceptic, said it was essential for the economic survival of our people that we adopt a more federalist route. I don't think any Conservative would say that today. The Labour Party mirrors the Conservatives today. The Labour Party was split down the middle. The majority of MPs were against, a strong majority of party members against, a minority in the cabinet against. The Scottish and Welsh nationalists were also both against, and they were the only parties in Scotland and Wales to advocate a no vote, and the worry then was that Britain as a whole might vote to stay in, but Scotland and Wales might vote to stay out. The only party that was consistent with the Liberals, now the Liberal Democrats, consistently pro-European. And the battle then was primarily a battle within the Labour Party, as today it's a battle within the Conservative Party. And this was largely for ideological reasons, as I think it is today in part. But Labour was then a party believing in state control, and it was not natural for such a party to believe in Europe, because there seemed at that time a credible alternative to Europe, namely socialist or social democratic planning, which Europe, Labour said, would prevent. Free of Europe, they said we could build socialism in one country. And I think it's some similarity, perhaps, with the attitude of some people in Sweden who felt that the European Union would interfere with her advanced welfare state. Now, the first two post-war Labour leaders, Attlee and Gaitskell, were both hostile to the European communities. And Attlee once gave a typically laconic speech to the Common Market Safeguards Committee of the Labour Party in the 1960s. It was actually an anti-European group. And Attlee said, "We're asked to join the Six." There was a pause, and he said, "The Six." He said, "I seem to remember that in the war we spent a lot of blood and treasure to rescue 4 of them from the other 2. And then he sat down. Hugh Gaitskell, his successor, said that Europe would be the end of 1,000 years of history. So they were against it because there was a left ideological alternative, namely social democracy in one country. And Margaret Thatcher and those who supported her came to believe that there was a right ideological alternative, namely a free market Britain, which the European Union would prevent. And today, many conservatives and neoliberals, if you like, people who support the Institute for Economic Affairs, they continue to believe this, though of course the belief in the social democratic alternative is almost gone. For example, the economists for Brexit last week, people like Tim Condon and Patrick Minford, they say that out of the European Union we could remove social regulations and become a kind of free trading global hub, Singapore or Hong Kong, if you like, Thatcherism in one country. Now, both the ideological left and the ideological right today against Europe interferes with their strategy. But there is and was, and here's a continuity between the 70s, a very powerful democratic case against Europe, and I think it was best articulated by the Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell, who had been long dead at the time of the 75 referendum. A very powerful speech he made to the 1962 Labour Party conference. His admirers, who tend to be pro-Europe, say that Gaitskell was opposed to the terms in which Britain entered, that may be what he thought. But he produced arguments which were arguments in principle against Europe and incompatible with the European community. And he made 2 fundamental points which have resonated right through the European debate today. The first was that the European community was more than a free trade area, and so that power would be transferred from national governments to unaccountable transnational bodies with power to make laws binding on Parliament. And that, of course, was confirmed shortly after Gaitskell's death by the Costa case in 1964, which made clear the superiority of European law over national legal systems, though I think it was already implicit in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. So that the European community was not merely an international organisation like NATO or the UN, but a system of law superior to that of Parliament. And Gaitskell went on to say that any attempt to make Europe more democratic would lead to federalism in this sense, that if the unelected European bodies were made accountable, there would then be a democratic institution superior to Parliament, and Britain would in effect be a subordinate unit in a quasi-federal organisation. He said it means that powers are taken from national governments and handed over to federal governments and federal parliaments. It does mean, if this is the idea, the end of Britain as an independent state. Certainly the end of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, national and parliamentary sovereignty are often confused. And during the debate in the 1970s, many pro-Europeans said there'd be no fundamental loss of sovereignty. What they meant was national sovereignty. And of course, we've shared sovereignty over many centuries, and we share it, for example, in NATO and the United Nations. That's easy. But parliamentary sovereignty cannot be shared. It is not a matter of degree. It is all or nothing. You can't. It's not like baldness. It's more like virginity. You can't be a qualified virgin or a qualified sovereign. You either have it or you haven't. And you lose parliamentary sovereignty to a superior lawmaking body. But Parliament no longer has the sole right to authorise law, nor the sole right to tax. Now, the second fundamental point that Gaitskell made was this was an issue of such transcendental importance, it couldn't be taken by Parliament alone, and the people must decide, though he didn't advocate a referendum, but a general election. And he said in his speech, and this again echoes through the years, we are being told the British people are not capable of judging this issue. The top people are the only people who understand it. This is the classic argument of every tyranny in history. It begins as a refined intellectual argument, and it moves into a one-man dictatorship. We did not win the political battles of the 19th and 20th centuries to have this reactionary nonsense thrust upon us again. The argument the government knew best was, he said, an odious piece of hypocritical, supercilious, arrogant rubbish. And as if to prove his point, in 1974, the ex-president of the European Commission, Jean Rey, said this when the referendum was under discussion. A referendum on this matter consists of consulting people who don't know the problems instead of consulting people who know them. I would deplore a situation in which the policy of this great country should be left to housewives. It should be decided instead by trained and informed people. The argument against the referendum by the pro-marketeers was that if they wanted to defend the sovereignty of Parliament, it was inconsistent to have a referendum. But the pro-referendum people could say Parliament can do what it likes, it can call for a referendum. And the referendum came about in an accidental, unpremeditated way as a result of conflicts within the Labour Party in opposition after 1970. And the constitutional arguments for and against it were not deployed till the referendum had actually been decided by the politicians. Now, in opposition, Harold Wilson, the leader of the Labour Party, faced a challenge from the left. The Labour Party often moved to the left in opposition. But the left was joined by some figures on the right, particularly the then Shadow Home Secretary, James Callaghan, a man very popular with the grassroots in the Labour Party, who said he did not need opinion polls to tell him what people were thinking. And in May 1971, and again I think this echoes through the years, he made a speech in Southampton, and he said that if the press wanted to hear the next leader of the Labour Party, they should come and listen to him. And he cast the speech as a response to President Pompidou of France, who had referred to French as the language of Europe and had dismissed English as the language of the United States. And that, of course, gave Callaghan his opening. He said millions of people in Britain have been surprised to hear that the language of Chaucer, Shakespeare and Milton must in future be regarded as an American import from which we must protect ourselves if we are to build a new Europe. We can agree that the French own the supreme prose literature in Europe, but if we are to prove our Europeanism by accepting that French is the dominant language in the community, then my answer is quite clear, and I will say it in French in order to prevent any misunderstanding. Non merci beaucoup. And that was, of course, to the French language superseding the English, which was rightly taken, and no doubt correctly taken, as a non to Europe full stop. And that was a clear threat to Wilson. So he developed a formula by which he said, we'll oppose entry to Europe on Tory terms, as he put it, and we will put the issue to the people after renegotiation in a general election or a referendum. Now, since there were two general elections in 1974, you couldn't really have a third on Europe, so we had the referendum. Now, though it came about for tactical reasons, there was, in my view, a principled case for it, as there is now. The first was that in 1970, the last general election before entry, all three parties were in favour of entry. So there's no way in which the voters could, as a result of their vote, indicate they were against entry. And similarly, in the last general election in Britain in 2015, all three major parties believed we should stay in the European Union. So there was no way in which a voter could show by her vote that she was not in favour of remaining in. So the party system was not working effectively. But secondly, even if it had been working effectively, a decision by Parliament alone on a matter of this kind would lack legitimacy. And this is a weakness in the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, that some decisions are so fundamental that a decision by Parliament alone could not secure legitimacy. And this point was made well, I think, by Edward Short, leader of the House of Commons in 1975, who said the issue continues to divide the country. The decision to go in has not been accepted. That is the essence of the case of having a referendum. And similarly, Cameron, in his Bloomberg speech in 2013, in which he called for the referendum, said that consent for Europe was, in his own words, wafer thin and needed endorsement by the people. That MPs were given the authority to legislate, but not to transfer the powers of Parliament away from Westminster. And that is now clear in our system of government, that before the powers of Parliament are transferred upwards to Europe, according to the European Union Act of 2011, a referendum is needed, and before they're transferred downwards through devolution, also a referendum is needed, and of course if part of the country wants to secede. So the referendum gives us a form of constitutional protection against the powers of Parliament being transferred against the will of the people. And the Labour government, which came to power rather unexpectedly in March 1974 as a minority government, began its renegotiation, which they did not enjoy. The new Foreign Secretary was in fact James Callaghan, who made the language of Chaucer speech. And when journalists said to him negotiations are fun, he said, what? Haggling with the French. The French are awful. And they listed 6 major changes that they wanted needed. The first was a major change in the common agricultural policy. That was not achieved. The second was a new and fairer method of financing the community budget. That was achieved in theory, but it didn't work to Britain's advantage as hoped, and had to be renegotiated by Margaret Thatcher in the Fontainebleau Agreement in 1984. Then there was resistance to proposals for monetary union, but that wasn't on the agenda at the time. Then a retention of national parliamentary powers to pursue effective regional, industrial and fiscal policies. That wasn't a problem because Europe didn't threaten that. Then better safeguards for Commonwealth and developing countries, particularly Commonwealth dairy products. And then no harmonisation of VAT. That wasn't on the agenda either. Significantly, reform of the common fisheries policy wasn't proposed. There was no chance of achieving that either. Now, at the very beginning, Wilson and Callaghan outmanoeuvred the antis because, like Cameron, they said that renegotiation would not involve treaty revision. And the antis could not argue against that because there was a second general election very shortly afterwards, so they could not really dispute what the Prime Minister was doing. But the Eurosceptics then, as with the Conservative Eurosceptics now, wanted repatriation of powers from Europe. There was no chance of achieving that in any way. And they also wanted, as the Eurosceptics want, the right of the British Parliament to reject European legislation, which they don't like. Again, that wasn't achieved and wasn't possible to achieve. It's fair to say that today the Foreign Office had a report on the balance of powers between Britain and Europe, and concluded the balance was about right, that there weren't any powers taken which affected Britain deleteriously, broadly speaking. Now, the second election in 1974 was held in October, and the Labour Party manifesto was much more positive towards Europe, but it raised an extreme and improbable threat to make clear that Labour intend to stay. It was a politician's trick. They said Labour is an internationalist party and Britain is a European nation. And then the improbable threat came in. But if the common market were to mean the creation of a new protectionist bloc, or if British membership threatened to impoverish our working people, or to destroy the authority of Parliament, then Labour could not agree. That clearly wasn't happening. Now, the renegotiation, as with Cameron's, was not fundamental, but it's fair to say cosmetic. and the key decision of principle was taken immediately after the election when Labour won, that renegotiation would not mean amending the Treaty of Rome. And the same with Cameron's renegotiation. And the other countries said, broadly speaking, they were willing to negotiate on specifics, provided it did not affect the fundamentals of the European Union, the fundamental principles of the CAP, today rules of free movement, and so on. And I think that was achieved in both cases. And I think in both cases the renegotiation was successful, and it showed that the European Union, the European community then, was not composed of ill-intentioned foreigners seeking to do the British down, but was comprised member states which were anxious to accommodate Britain and prepared to think again, particularly on the budget in 1974, if there was evidence of clear injustice. And I think you could say something similar about David Cameron's renegotiation. Now, the cabinet was divided, and there was an agreement to differ, as there is now. 7 out of the 23 ministers opposed Britain's continued membership. They included heavyweights. I think it's probably fair to say greater heavyweights than today. Michael Foot, who was to become leader of the Labour Party, Tony Benn, Barbara Castle, Peter Shaw, and 3 others. And that was the agreement to differ on the referendum. But it was restricted, as it is now, to the campaign in the country, that in Parliament ministers had to accept the government line. And it produced some odd outcomes when anti-market ministers were defending government policy. And Peter Shaw, the Trade Secretary, said on one occasion, "When I am speaking from the dispatch box, I am reflecting government policy as a whole, except when I am clearly reflecting my own policy as the Secretary of State for Trade." Now, the issue in the referendum, as today, was not simply, do you approve of the renegotiated terms, what do you think of the new budget arrangements, or today, the new arrangements for dairy products in New Zealand, or today about the migrant break, and so on, but the issue of principle, do you want to stay in or out? And as I say, the referendum resulted in a 2-to-1 majority for staying in Europe. 6 months before, the outcome had appeared doubtful. It was very even, with the no's perhaps having a slight advantage. So the key question was why the yeses won. And I think there were 2 fundamental reasons. Neither of these 2 reasons, I think, are there as strongly today. Firstly, it's worth saying that Europe itself was always a low salience issue in the polls. The main worry was not Europe, it was the question of food prices. And it's fair to say the British electorate is not on the whole interested in issues of procedure, but issues of substance. They don't care much about constitutional issues, sadly, for the sale of my books, but are interested in matters of substance instead. Then it was food prices, today it's immigration. And the 2 fundamental reasons for the result. The first was fear, that at that time Britain was the sick man economically in Europe, and the continent seemed to be thriving. Inflation was 27% in Britain in June 1975, the highest ever recorded. Unemployment was rising, and there was fear of the power of the trade unions. One of Britain's European commissioners, Sir Christopher Soames, said, "This is no time for Britain to be considering leaving a Christmas club, let alone the common market." And at an all-day cabinet at Chequers in November 1974, James Callaghan, the Foreign Secretary, said that every morning when he shaved, he thought he should emigrate. But by the time he'd eaten breakfast, he realised there was nowhere else to go. And Europe then seemed to have found the secret of economic progress. It seemed we couldn't afford not to be in it. Now today, of course, the opposite is true. We are doing economically much better than Europe, and Europe seems to be in severe difficulties. And while there was some enthusiasm for Europe in the 70s, that is not there today. The argument for Remain is Europe has many weaknesses, but better to be in than out. Now, the second reason, I think, was the effect of party cues and the leadership effect. People took their cues from their party leaders. The issues were complicated, and all 3 party leaders were in favour of us remaining. In her memoirs, Barbara Castle, who was campaigning against British membership, says in some frustration that she was canvassing a lady who said, "Well, I've heard what you've said, but Mr. Wilson takes a different view." Interestingly enough, I've been informed that Mary Wilson, Wilson's wife, actually voted against the European referendum. Now, who was for Europe? The three-party leaders. The ex-Prime Minister Edward Heath, who was still popular in the country, Roy Jenkins, William Whitelaw, Shirley Williams. Who was against? Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Ian Paisley, who said the Virgin Mary is the Madonna of the common market. The National Front, the precursor of the British National Party, the Communist Party, and the main union leaders. And the trick was to label anyone who was against Europe as a wild extremist. And so the referendum, in a way, was not only about Europe, it was a straight left and right battle, with the normal dividing line shifting further to the left than in general elections because of the Labour split. So it was really the moderates against the Labour left and the extreme right. And one Conservative commentator said, in all the speeches I made, the trump card was always beware of Tony Benn, Michael Foot, and Barbara Castle. So the fear was there, the fear of what, not only what would happen if we left, but the fear of those advocating a no vote, the fear of extremism. And Roy Jenkins said at the final rally for Britain in Europe before the referendum, for Britain to leave would be to go into an old people's home for fading nations. I do not think it would be a very comfortable old people's home. I do not like the look of some of the prospective wardens. And Harold Wilson said the main reason for voting yes was a victory for no would empower the wrong kind of people in Britain, the Benn left and the Powell right, who were often extreme nationalists, protectionist, xenophobic, and backward-looking. Now the question is, will all that happen again today, when the parties are more discredited, there's less deference towards politicians? And there was a further positive reason then for voting yes, which isn't there today, remembering the Second World War and the Cold War. And one lady said, I don't like the community, but I voted to stay in for my grandchildren. So that was a further reason which isn't there now. Now, there was one dog that did not bark in the referendum that I think is barking today. The antis, Enoch Powell and his largely working-class Tory following, and the left of the Labour Party were anti-establishment and united by nationalism. And what they tried to do was to produce an anti-establishment nationalist grassroots movement against Europe, which we now have with UKIP, the Farage phenomenon. And that's the movement that arose in Norway in the 1970s and kept Norway out of Europe, although most of the leading politicians wanted Norway in. Now, Powell tried to arouse the British people who were being told that they must take the advice of those who knew best. He echoed Hugh Gaitskell in 1962. He said, let's look at the record of those people who know best, who can tell you what will be good for Britain, not just this year or next year, but for generations to come. We discover these are the very people who have always been wrong. Not one horse they ever tipped has ever won. Now, people said afterwards they were deceived. They were voting for an economic free trade area and nothing more. I don't think that argument can be sustained. The term common market appeared extensively in the No pamphlet, but was hardly used by Europhiles at all. And their tone was well put by Edward Heath in his first speech in the Commons after being deprived of the Tory leadership. He said Europe was founded for a political purpose, not a party purpose, not even a federal purpose, as some would argue. The political purpose was to absorb the new Germany into the structure of the European family, and economic means were adopted for that very political purpose. Today the issue is still a great political purpose. Now, the government pamphlet to every household did not stress the loss of sovereignty to a superior legal order. It's fair to say that at that time it wasn't as serious as it is now, because the so-called Luxembourg Compromise gave states in effect a veto on policy they didn't like. The Luxembourg Compromise was in effect removed by Margaret Thatcher, of all people, in 1986 in the Single European Act, and she removed it to encourage majority voting because that was in Britain's interests, because given that the internal market would be in our interest, you wouldn't get it if each member state had a veto on removing each non-tariff barrier. So it's a good example, perhaps, of how Europe partly worked in Britain's interest. So it wasn't wholly misleading to say, as the government did, that no important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British Parliament, government and a British Parliament. These decisions can be taken only if all the members of the Council agree. The Minister representing Britain can veto any proposal for a new law or a new tax. Now, the opponents of the of entry did not claim that the people were being deceived. And Enoch Powell said on the TV results programme, "I make no complaint of the pro-marketeers. They have been beyond criticism in that they have made it clear that to remain part of the common market is to renounce national status of Britain. They say the nation state is obsolete and we are to recognise it." So he conceded that Heath and others did not say that Europe was just a trading arrangement. And most of the things that the sceptics dislike, free movement, supremacy of European law, were already there in 1975. So I think that that is not a fair criticism. Now, the referendum legitimised Europe in Britain for a while. One of Harold Wilson's advisors said that Edward Heath had taken the British establishment into Europe, but it needed Harold Wilson to take the people into Europe. Now perhaps the establishment remains, but the people don't, and that's the basic case for the second referendum. And the result was a great triumph for Harold Wilson, I think. And if one compares the splits in the past on things like the Corn Laws, tariff reform, Gladstone on Home Rule, and so on, Wilson kept his party together and wasn't destroyed by it as Heath, Thatcher and Major were destroyed. Now, the outcome seemed favourable, but it didn't last for long. The referendum went well, I think partly because it was a yes vote. If there had been a no vote, people would have said, we reject the government's policy. Could Harold Wilson have survived as Prime Minister? Could Cameron survive as Prime Minister to carry out a policy to which he is opposed and which he has advised the people to reject? The Antis want to restore parliamentary sovereignty, but if they'd succeeded then, or succeed now, parliamentary sovereignty will be constrained not by Brussels, but by popular sovereignty, by the will of the people, because Parliament will be required to do something which it doesn't want to do because of the will of the people. So we will have, indeed we do have, a new method of making laws in Britain by which the people are a third chamber of the legislature on certain issues. It's not clear whether the government could have gone on. It did not settle the issue, of course. It's a running sore in British politics since then. The referendum hasn't settled other issues. It hasn't settled Scottish independence. In my view, it hasn't settled the issue of the electoral system. The key question for today, I think, is whether the establishment can still pull it off the way they pulled it off in 1975, or whether the political class is now so much less respected that people no longer follow their cues, and whether the anti-establishment campaign that Enoch Powell tried in vain to summon up in 1975 could succeed today, perhaps under the leadership of Nigel Farage and UKIP. And the fear element then kept us in, will it do so today? When he was asked to explain the result, Roy Jenkins said rather incautiously, people took the advice of those they were used to following. Now, this leaves open the following large question: will they still take the advice of those they have been used to following? Now, it's difficult enough for the historian to find out what happened in the past, so I'm not going to make any attempt to predict the future. And I once heard the Oxford historian A.J. Pete Taylor say, we learn from history not to make the mistakes of the past, and that leaves us free to make new and different ones instead. So perhaps I might end by reminding you of what Bevin said in 1950 about the coal and steel community. Once you open that Pandora's box, a lot of Trojan horses will fly out.
Thank you very much indeed, Vernon. We're now going to go to Lord Butler for his responses to...
Well, these responses are not going to be the responses of opposition. It isn't absolutely a universal event that I agree with Vernon, but I think his account has been masterly, and I think we've been privileged to hear it. And perhaps what I can add is a bit of personal testimony, because as Andrew said, I was one of Harold Wilson's private secretaries at the time. I was also actually one of Ted Heath's private secretaries when we went into Europe, and of course that's the British civil service system. Now, it's clear to me that Harold Wilson, throughout this, had three objectives. The first one, which I think Vernon implicitly said was the dominant one, was it was the only way to resolve the difficulties within the Labour Party and to hold the Labour Party together. That was the reason for the device. As Vernon said, you can justify having a referendum on this matter of such huge constitutional importance, but there's no doubt that that was Harold Wilson's principal objective. The second objective, but I think it was subsidiary to it, was to try to secure some improvements in the terms on which the Conservatives had taken Britain into Europe. And it was a theme, as Vernon said, that ran through the election: no membership on Tory terms. And Vernon mentioned the 6 areas where Labour wanted improvement, of which really only 2 were material at the time. And one was the issue of whether Britain's subscription to the EEC was fair, and the other was the terms of our trade, particularly with Commonwealth countries and Commonwealth preference, and the impact that had on the price of food within Britain. So, to try to get some improvements. But the third was to keep Britain in the EEC. And I have evidence, as it were, internal evidence, that that was always Harold Wilson's objective, though he took care to conceal it. He was a master at the manipulation of his party, and he really concealed that very effectively. And I'm going to tell you something about the tactics that he pursued in the renegotiation, the lead up to the general election, to the referendum, that illustrate that. But when he became Prime Minister in the fraught circumstances of February 1974, during the coal miners' strike, he came in as Prime Minister. He kept the 5 of us who were the civil service private secretaries there, he kept exactly the same team. Now, part of the reason he did that was, of course, that he started his own life as a civil servant. He'd been Prime Minister for 6 years, between 1964 and 1970. He respected the British civil service tradition. And so he had confidence that the civil servants working there would work just as assiduously for him as they had done for Ted Heath. But some of us said to him when he came in, now, Mr. Wilson, we've got to tell you, we were part of Ted Heath's machine for the negotiations that took us into the common market. And he said, you will have no trouble with me about that. He didn't say this publicly, but he made it pretty clear to us privately that his own opinion was that he wanted to retain Britain as a member of the EEC. These objectives are strikingly similar to the objectives of Mr. Cameron today. Because I don't think we would have ever had this referendum if it hadn't been the only way in which David Cameron could see of resolving the difficulties within his party. I believe also that David Cameron genuinely wanted some improvements in Britain's membership. I mean, in particular, I think he wanted improvements, continues to want improvements, in the European Union itself. And that was an objective, but it was not the primary objective. And he is clear, I think, and in this I think he's been, as it were, sussed out very much earlier than Harold Wilson was. He wants to remain, Britain to remain within the EU. And on a day when he has made remarks that suggest that the peace in Europe won't be secure if we were to leave, what he was originally saying only a few months ago, that unless the negotiations were successful, he didn't rule out recommending leave, that looks now rather hollow, and I've no doubt at all that he always wanted to keep Britain within the EU, and the referendum is a party device, something that he probably, I'm sure now, doesn't welcome, but would rather not have had. So there are great similarities between Harold Wilson's position in '75 and David Cameron's today. But as Vernon made clear, the context, the national context, was really quite different. Today, I mean, as we sit here, you could say that the referendum is the only political game in town. It certainly wasn't in 1975. Britain was in severe economic difficulties. It was described as the sick man of Europe. Unemployment and inflation were both high and rising. We were heading towards what happened in only the following year of the IMF crisis and Britain's balance of payments deficit and the growth of British debt. Our industrial relations were a preoccupation. The Conservative government had lost power through the miners' strike, and the issue had been who governs Britain. And similarly, Britain had only been a member of the EEC for 2 years, and so Europe was not nearly so entrenched a part of our national life. So at that time, the referendum, though important, was not the only game in town. And the issue in 1975, at least the ostensible issue, was the terms of membership. Now, I think today, it is the EU itself and the nature of the EU. And so the emphasis in the referendum coming up today is really rather different from the way it was in 1975. I mentioned that I think Harold Wilson's tactics in dealing with the differences in his party were rather more subtle than David Cameron's has been. Though I think the circumstances in which he could operate were easier for him because of the different contexts that I've described. I'm now going to tell you, as it were, from my personal experience, what I saw happen and what I saw Harold Wilson's foot. As Vernon has said, the start of the renegotiation and the lead-up to the referendum happened after the autumn general election of 1974, when Labour were returned with a bigger majority, but not the size of majority which Harold Wilson had hoped. And the start of the negotiations was to be at the meeting of the European Council in Paris in December of 1974. Now, shortly before that happened, the Chancellor of Germany, who was an important figure then, as Chancellor Merkel is today, had been invited over and had addressed the Labour Party conference, and actually made rather a pro-EEC, pro-European speech there. After the conference, Harold Wilson had arranged that Schmidt should go and stay at Chequers for the weekend, and this was the weekend before the meeting of in Paris, the European Council, which launched the negotiations. I have no doubt that over that weekend, Harold Wilson agreed with Schmidt the changes which Schmidt would support, and which therefore the European Council, the leaders, might be persuaded to agree to in the negotiations. During that week, at the Cabinet, Harold Wilson referred to his meeting with Schmidt, but he also referred to the European Council that was coming up. And he said to the Cabinet that if he could not get agreements on the terms of trade with the Commonwealth and on measures to relieve Britain of its budget contributions reflecting the economic difficulties that the country was going through, he would personally recommend a no vote. In a sense, slightly similar to what Cameron said, but rather more strongly. And I remember very clearly that this made Ben and Foote and Varley and Shaw really very cheerful, the antis in the cabinet, because these seemed really rather ambitious objectives that they thought it was unlikely that Harold Wilson would get at the Paris Council. And the end of that week, I think it was the Friday evening, it might have been Saturday evening, before Harold Wilson was to fly off to Paris for the council, he had a long-standing engagement to address the London Society of Labour Mayors. It's always rather amused me that I think the mayors had absolutely no idea of the part that had been cast to them in Harold Wilson's strategy. At this dinner, he put what he'd said to the cabinet the other way round. He said, "These are my objectives with which I'm going to Paris. If I can achieve these, I will recommend the British people to vote yes in the referendum." I happened to be the number 10 private secretary on duty that weekend, so I was fielding the whatever happened. And I remember that the following morning, the telephone was hot with Foote and Shaw and Ben ringing up and saying, "Who authorised the Prime Minister to say this?" And I was able, on instructions, to point to the cabinet minutes where he'd said that if he couldn't get these terms, he'd recommend a no vote, and I think they had to agree that one thing was the corollary of the other. Only at that moment, I think, did they see the trap that opened up for them. So Harold Wilson went off to the Paris Council. That was not the end of the negotiations. The negotiations were launched, and they were brought to a conclusion at the Dublin Council a few months later, from which Harold Wilson came back and said, "These are the terms I've achieved, this is what I wanted," and he took them to the cabinet. A majority of the cabinet supported them, but as again Vernon pointed out, we've got to remember a majority of the Labour MPs in the House of Commons, majority of the party, voted against them. And it was only because the Conservative Party were solid, I think there were only 9 dissenters, that the Parliament endorsed them. The other thing I think just to say about this, again to remind you of the context, that the agreement to differ that there was in the Labour cabinet at that time was a really, in the terms of the judgments at the time, was a really very radical departure that Harold Wilson introduced. There'd never been anything like it before. I think there had actually on one occasion, and Vernon will remember what, in the 1930s.
That was a coalition government, not in a single party government.
Yes, that's right.
A coalition, the argument was
That's right.
coalition.
So in a single party government, it was a really extraordinary innovation. Now we're so used to the cabinet all disagreeing with each other and these disagreements coming out in public that it's not nearly so remarkable. But it was remarkable at the time. And then Vernon raised an interesting question. Could Harold Wilson have survived if the vote had gone the other way? And we don't know the answer to that question, but of course, actually, to everybody's surprise, less than a year later, Harold Wilson resigned when people weren't expecting him to in the spring of 1976. I got the curious feeling that had the referendum gone the other way, he would have stayed longer, because he would not have liked to have gone out on this failure. He was always, I believe, intending to go on his 60th birthday. He had to delay it a bit in the spring of 1976. But I don't think he would have liked to have gone out on this note. And again, I mean, it illustrates, I think, the different political climate at the time, that had the referendum gone against him, this was just one of the sort of things that was happening. This was stuff. And I don't think it would have been regarded as nearly likely to be politically fatal to him as defeat in the referendum now. The only other gloss I would offer on what Vernon said was this question of whether membership of the EU takes away parliamentary sovereignty. And of course, while we are members of the EU, yes, it does. It compromises because our Parliament has got to accept laws that are made in the EU. But what I think constitutionalists would say, that since Parliament has got a right to leave the EU, to apply for Article 50, as may happen following the referendum, the British Parliament has ultimately always maintained its sovereignty. And that mark of sovereignty is now the decision to leave, if that's what the way in which the referendum